Okay, so, as thinkers, we're always kind of circling back to these fundamental questions, like how do we actually, know anything?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's like a question that never really loses its grip, and it's definitely driven philosophical inquiry for, well, forever. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we're going to be going on this journey, exploring the history of, well, a pretty important concept, you could say, a cornerstone of epistemology even,
Yeah,
empiricism.
right.
So at its heart, it puts forward this idea that seems pretty straightforward, at least on the surface, that experience, what we experience, is the primary source of knowledge, maybe even the only source. And it's a view that still has a huge impact on debates in philosophy today.
For sure, for sure. And to really get into this, we've got this, well, amazing resource. We're working with excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on ancient and medieval empiricism.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And we're not just skimming the surface here. This is like a deep, detailed map of how people have thought about this idea for centuries. We're going back to the thinkers who basically laid the groundwork for how we even think about knowledge today.
I mean, when you hear the word empiricism now, it's easy to just think about science, right? Like observations, experiments, checking things with your senses.
Yeah, yeah.
But what's really fascinating is that this wasn't just some sudden invention. It's got these ancient origins, and we can trace it back to ancient Greece and all the way through the Middle Ages.
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive then. We want to trace that intellectual lineage, see how this idea, this core belief that experience is where knowledge comes from, evolved from its earliest expressions in ancient times all the way to the nuanced ways it was developed in the medieval period. And we want to find those key moments, those aha connections that can help us understand the debates about knowledge that are still happening today.
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
Let's do it.
So let's start by looking at the very first hints of an empiricist attitude, you could say, way back in ancient Greek thought. It's easy to think empiricism is a modern thing, but the basic elements were already there, bubbling up.
Yeah. Even before they had full-blown systems of philosophy, you can see these thinkers who started to put more value on what they could directly perceive, the stuff right in front of them. Like Heraclitus, right? He said that the things of which there is sight, hearing, experience, these I prefer. Sounds pretty common sense, right? Trusting your senses.
It does, yeah. But he also had this crucial caveat, this little warning that we still see today. He said that poor witnesses for men are the eyes and ears of those who have barbarian souls. So even back then, there was this tension. It makes sense to trust your senses, but we all know they can be misinterpreted. It's a problem we're still dealing with in epistemology.
Right, right.
And then there's Empedocles. He was all about understanding each thing in the way in which it is clear, through the senses. Again, that emphasis on sensory input. But all this was happening when people were starting to seriously question whether those senses could even be trusted at all.
Oh, yeah.
The Eleatics, philosophers like Parmenides and Melissus, they were all about a priori reasoning. So that's knowledge you get just from thinking without any experience.
Okay.
They thought reason could show you a reality that was totally different from what you see and hear.
Wow.
And this was a huge challenge for those early scientists trying to understand the natural world by observing it.
Right.
Because if you can't even trust what you're seeing, why bother studying it? This fight between trusting your senses and trusting your reason, that's still going on today.
Yeah, that's a big obstacle, for sure. If you can't trust your senses, where do you even start trying to figure out how the world works?
Exactly. And some other pre-Socratic thinkers also wrestled with these limitations of trying to know stuff that goes beyond what you can see or hear. Like Xenophanes said, no man knows the truth about the gods and about everything I speak of, but seeming is wrought over all things.
Right.
So he's saying when we talk about things beyond what we can directly perceive, it's all just opinion, just appearances, not real knowledge.
But he wasn't saying we can't learn anything.
No, not at all.
The source mentions that he believed knowledge could grow.
Right.
So it's more like a warning to be careful about certainty, especially when you're dealing with stuff that's not empirically verifiable, things you can't test.
Yeah, exactly. And Alcmaeon of Croton, he had a similar idea. He contrasted how the gods could see unseen things perfectly, but humans, well, we just have to make guesses. It's he was admitting that it's really hard to know what's going on beyond our senses.
I see. What's interesting is how this focus on experience shows up in early medical writing.
Oh, how so?
Well, like the Hippocratic authors, they were against these big general theories about human nature, especially when it came to stuff like, the heavens or the underworld.
Right.
They wanted medicine to be based on what you could actually see and confirm.
That makes sense.
Right.
Stick to what you can observe.
Yeah, but there's this interesting tension in those writings. Because while they're saying don't make grand theories about things you can't see, they also talk about figuring out facts about the body by looking at things outside the body. Like using analogies to understand how things work on the inside by observing stuff on the outside.
So even though they valued experience, they weren't completely against making inferences.
Yeah, like they were saying, when you're treating someone, focus on what you can see, but also you got to use what you know to figure out stuff you can't see.
Makes sense.
And this idea about appearances being a window into the invisible, that's what Anaxagoras was talking about, right?
Yeah. He said, appearances are a vision of the invisible.
And even Democritus, the guy who came up with atomism, he used that idea too.
That's right. Think about it. The theory that the world is made of these tiny, invisible particles, atoms, he was using observable stuff to support that.
But didn't that create a problem for him?
What do you mean?
Well, our senses show us a world full of color, taste, all these qualities. But atomism says it's just atoms and empty space. It's like the evidence for the theory also goes against the theory.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And Democritus knew that.
He did.
Yeah, he even has this quote where he has the senses saying to the mind, "Wretched mind, after taking from us your evidence, do you overthrow us? Our fall will be your defeat."
It's like he knew there was this conflict between his theory and what our senses tell us.
That's amazing. So we've got this early appreciation for experience, this idea that it's important. But at the same time, people are starting to realize it's not that simple. There are limitations. And making inferences about what you can't see is tricky. And then comes Aristotle, who tries to make sense of all of this.
Yeah, Aristotle, he's like the guy when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Definitely. He's seen as a big proponent of empiricism because he truly believed in the senses, that they were reliable and absolutely crucial for learning about the world. He knew that not everything that appears is true, but he always said that to phenomena, what appears to us, that's where all inquiry has to start.
Right.
And for Aristotle, if your ideas don't match up with what we can observe, well, you're probably on the wrong track.
So he really emphasized sensation, aesthesis.
Yeah. Each sense had its own special objects, like color for sight, and he believed that most of the time, our senses don't lie to us. He even said, you can't learn anything without your senses. And that even thinking relies on images from the senses.
Yeah.
This sounds a lot like what we call genetic empiricism, the idea that knowledge starts with experience.
It does, yeah. And he totally disagreed with Plato's idea of innate ideas that we're born already knowing certain things.
Oh, yeah, completely. Think about math.
Yeah.
Plato thought math was about these eternal, perfect objects that we somehow remember from a past life. But Aristotle said no way. He believed mathematical concepts come from real features of things we can perceive. Like we see quantities, things that continue, things we can count. And from those, we get our ideas of numbers and shapes.
So no magic preloaded knowledge of triangles.
Nope. It all comes back to what we can see and touch in the world.
Okay. Now, the source asks this interesting question. Was Aristotle an explanatory empiricist?
What do they mean by that?
Well, he definitely accepted that we could make inferences, like seeing a rough tongue and concluding someone has a fever.
Yeah.
But he also seemed to think there's a difference between that kind of inference and real scientific knowledge.
Oh, I see.
For him, science needed to understand the causes of things.
Right.
So it wasn't enough to just know that a rough tongue means fever. You had to know why.
Makes sense.
He called it the difference between knowing the fact and knowing the reasoned fact.
Oh, interesting. So seeing a sign, like the tongue, tells you that something is happening, but science tells you why it's happening.
Right. And this leads to his idea of epagogia, which is often translated as induction.
Induction.
This is how we figure out universal principles, the general rules that apply to everything.
Right. And he said it's different from deduction, where you start with general rules and apply them to specific cases. Induction goes the other way, from specific observations to general rules.
Like seeing a bunch of white swans and saying, all swans are white.
Yeah, which, of course, isn't always true.
Right. But that's the basic idea, and this is where things get really complicated. How do we go from seeing a bunch of individual things to understanding something that applies to all things of that kind?
Yeah, that's the big question. Like, is it just that we see a lot of white swans and assume they're all white?
Well, Aristotle knew that just counting things wasn't enough.
He did.
Yeah, how can you be sure just from a limited number of observations? And plus, he also said that these basic principles of science are self-evident, like they're just true in themselves, which kind of goes against the idea that we figure them out step by step from observing things.
So if it's not just counting up observations, what is induction then?
That's the mystery. The source mentions this idea of an immediate apprehension of essences during perception.
Okay.
But if we're just grasping these essences directly, does that mean we're not really relying on experience?
Like, is there some kind of intuition that goes beyond our senses?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a tricky part of trying to understand Aristotle's empiricism.
It is. But one way to look at it is to focus on what he said about sensing particulars, but having a sensation of the universal.
That sounds kind of contradictory.
I know, right? But some people think he meant that we start with a general awareness, a sense of a type of thing through our senses.
Okay.
Like we see a swan and immediately know it's a swan, even if we don't know all the details yet.
So it's like we have this basic understanding, and then through more experience, we learn more and refine that understanding.
Exactly. Experience gives us this initial rough grasp of the universal, but it's not fully formed yet. Then we need more experience to really understand why things are the way they are.
But can we ever get to that point of understanding why things must be a certain way just through experience?
Yeah. Or do we need something else, something more than just our senses?
That's a question philosophers are still debating.
They are, but even though there's debate about the details, Aristotle's focus on experience as the starting point and his rejection of Plato's innate ideas, that definitely puts him in the camp of ancient empiricism.
All right, so after Aristotle, we move on to the Hellenistic period, and this is where we see groups who called themselves empiricists.
Oh, really? So they were like, we're the empiricists.
Yeah, especially in medicine. They were all about the practical stuff, diagnosing and treating illnesses.
Makes sense.
And they were against the rationalists or dogmatists who loved these big abstract theories and talked about hidden causes of diseases.
Sounds familiar.
Right. It's very similar to how we think about empirical science today. Observation, seeing how things relate to each other, no speculation about invisible stuff.
Yeah, they rejected what they called analogism.
What's that?
It's when you start with what you can observe, but then you go off into these explanations that you can't verify. Instead, they preferred epilogism, focusing on what's obvious, what you can see, and using that to figure out what's hidden based on what you've observed before.
So like seeing certain symptoms and based on past experience, knowing what the underlying illness is, even though you can't directly see it.
Exactly.
So for these medical empiricists, making inferences was okay, but only if you stuck to observable connections. No wild guesses about hidden stuff. Sounds like explanatory empiricism.
It is. They believed that if you observed carefully and kept track of everything you saw, that was enough to be a good doctor.
Interesting. Now, the Epicureans, another Hellenistic school, they were also empiricists, but they had a different take on things.
How so?
Well, they were all about genetic empiricism, too. Senses as the foundation of knowledge.
Right.
But, unlike others, they thought that immediate perception, what your senses tell you right now, is never wrong.
Never.
Yeah, they thought that mistakes come from how we judge what we sense, not from the senses themselves.
So, like, if I see a stick that looks bent in water,
Right.
the sensation of the bent stick is real, but thinking the stick is actually bent, that's the mistake.
Exactly. And they had this whole theory to explain why our senses are so reliable.
It did?
Yeah, it's called the theory of simulacra, or idula.
What are those?
Basically, they thought that objects are constantly giving off these tiny, tiny particles, like images of themselves, and our senses pick those up and process them, and that's how we get accurate information about the world.
Okay.
But their empiricism went beyond just the five senses we usually think of.
It did.
Yeah, they thought the mind itself was like another sense.
Really?
Yeah, it could pick up these idula directly. And Lucretius, he was a big Epicurean. He even used this to explain dreams.
Dreams.
He thought that dreams are actually accurate reflections of the world, but because we're dreaming, we misinterpret them.
Fascinating.
And unlike those medical empiricists, the Epicureans were more open to making inferences about things you can't observe.
They were?
Yeah, but they had a rule for when it was okay.
What was that?
They said that if a hypothesis doesn't contradict what you can observe, then it's okay to accept it.
Makes sense.
And they even thought that in an infinite universe, multiple explanations could be true just in different places or at different times.
That's pretty open-minded. So they were definitely grounded in experience, but they were willing to think about the unseen world as long as it didn't clash with what they could see.
Right. Now let's talk about the Stoics, another big Hellenistic school. They were empiricists too, probably influenced by the Epicureans.
I see.
They use this metaphor of the mind as a tabula rasa, a blank slate.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It means we're not born with any innate ideas. We learn everything from experience.
Right.
But the source says there's a nuance to their view, especially when it comes to morality.
Morality.
Yeah, they thought that ideas about justice and goodness, those are acquired naturally.
Naturally, but not necessarily through experience.
It's like they thought we have a natural inclination towards those ideas, but they still need experience to develop.
Oh, okay. So not fully formed ideas at birth, but like a tendency towards them.
Right. And the Stoics also had this idea of apprehensive presentation as the test of truth.
What does that mean?
So it's not just any sensation. It has to be caused by something real, accurately reflect that thing, and be so clear that it can't be from something that doesn't exist.
So like if I see an apple and it's clear and sharp and there's no reason to think I'm hallucinating.
Exactly. That's an apprehensive presentation. It forces you to believe it's true.
Makes sense. So it wasn't just about how strong the sensation is, but also about whether you can trust it.
Right. And what about their view on explanatory empiricism? Were they cautious about inferring things like the medical empiricists?
They were more cautious than the Epicureans, for sure. They knew that a lot of what causes things in nature is hidden. So they didn't want to make claims about stuff they couldn't see. Like they weren't sure about where the soul is or what it's really like.
But they still thought you could make inferences about the unseen, right?
Yeah, they did. As long as the evidence was strong enough, sometimes they even used reason along with their observations.
So like a middle ground. They knew it's tough to know about hidden things, but they still thought it was possible.
Exactly. And because they were willing to make inferences, they got criticized by the skeptics.
Ah, the skeptics. They were all about suspending judgment, not believing anything for sure.
Right. They wanted to achieve tranquility in matters of opinion, no more worrying about what's true or false.
And it's funny, Sextus Empiricus, a famous skeptic, he had empiricus in his title.
Really?
Yeah, you might think that means he was an empiricist.
It would seem that way.
But that wasn't it at all. The skeptics weren't about picking sides. They wanted to show that all claims to knowledge, whether from senses or reason, could be doubted.
So they didn't think experience was the only way to know things? They thought that no way was guaranteed.
Exactly. And they even went after induction, the whole idea of going from specific observations to general rules.
They did.
Yeah, Sextus said you can never be absolutely sure because you can't observe everything. Like, how can you be sure all swans are white if you haven't seen every single swan?
Right. That's basically the problem of induction that we still talk about today.
It is. Now, the skeptical position, it sounds really hard to actually live by.
How could you get through life without believing anything?
Right. Well, Sextus said that in everyday life, we can rely on observed associations between things.
Okay.
Not as beliefs about how things must be connected, but just as practical rules of thumb.
I see.
Like, we know smoke usually means fire, so we act accordingly, even if we can't be certain that every single time there's smoke, there's fire.
So we use those associations to navigate the world, even if we don't fully believe in them.
Exactly. And he said we don't even need to think about it consciously. Like, even animals and people who can't read or write can do this. It's just a natural response to patterns we observe.
Interesting. So for the skeptics, using experience wasn't about having a specific theory. It was just about getting by in the world while not committing to any big beliefs.
Right. So that's the end of our look at ancient empiricism. We've seen how it started, how Aristotle developed it, and then the different approaches of the Hellenistic schools. Now let's jump ahead to the Middle Ages.
Perfect.
Now, medieval thought was heavily influenced by Christianity.
Of course.
So radical skepticism, like the skeptics, that didn't really catch on.
Makes sense.
And neither did the Epicureans with their focus on pleasure and a world without gods.
Right.
Stoicism had some impact, especially on ethics, but when it came to knowledge, Aristotle was the main man.
Back to Aristotle.
And they combined his ideas with Augustine's philosophy and theology. So we see the tabula rasa again, the blank slate, just like Aristotle said.
Okay.
But the source warns us not to think of this exactly like Locke's idea later on.
Oh, how so?
Well, medieval thinkers talked about the mind as a blank tablet, but they also believed in things like divine illumination or that God gives us certain capacities from birth.
Right.
Even Aquinas, who was a big fan of Aristotle, he thought we have an innate ability to understand basic truths.
Hmm.
So it's more like we have a potential for knowledge, but it's not like we're born knowing specific things.
I see.
And they blended these different ideas in interesting, like the blueprint of everything already inside it.
Yeah.
But he also said our intellect is like a blank slate because our access to that knowledge is blocked by our physical bodies.
That's pretty complex.
Yeah. So they had this qualified version of genetic empiricism, but they also started to emphasize justificatory empiricism.
Justificatory empiricism.
Yeah, it's about how we justify or prove that our knowledge is true. And Roger Bacon, he was key for this. He talked about scientia experimentalis, knowledge from experience. He said there are two kinds of this knowledge.
Two kinds.
Yeah. The first is when you use experience to confirm something you figured out through reason. Like you can logically prove that fire burns, but you only really know it when you feel the heat.
Makes sense.
And the second kind is even more interesting. It's knowledge that comes only from experience. You can't get there through reasoning at all.
Oh, wow.
This is where things like alchemy and the secrets of nature come in.
Secrets of nature.
Yeah, back then they thought some things worked in ways that regular science couldn't explain. Like they believed in magic, but natural magic, stuff that's part of the world, not supernatural.
Okay.
And they thought you could only learn about these things through observation, not through logic or reasoning.
So things like astrology, alchemy.
Yeah. And all sorts of weird phenomena they couldn't explain with the science of the time, like how a lodestone attracts iron. They have no idea why, but they could see it happening.
Right. And it's important to remember that when they talked about experience and experiment, they didn't mean what we mean today.
Oh, yeah, they weren't doing controlled experiments in a lab.
Nope. It was more like observing nature and even taking other people's word for things.
So experience was a much broader concept back then.
It was. And their idea of perception was different, too.
Oh, so?
Well, we usually think of the five senses, right? Sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell.
Yeah.
But medieval thinkers, they followed Avicenna, who said we also have interior senses.
Interior senses?
Yeah, like a second set of senses inside our minds.
Wow.
Aquinas simplified it to four: common sense, imagination, estimation, and memory.
Okay.
These weren't just passive things. They actively shaped how we understand the world. And they also believed in inner experience, like being aware of your own thoughts and feelings.
Right.
That was seen as a valid source of knowledge, too.
And Bacon, he even included spiritual experiences as part of experience.
So their idea of experience was much richer and more complex than ours.
It was. Now, a big shift in medieval thought was the decline of this idea called divine illumination.
What was that?
Augustine and his followers, they believed that to understand really important truths, like math or the essence of things, you needed a special light from God.
Oh, like a divine boost for your intellect.
Exactly. They thought our senses were too limited to get to those truths on their own. But then other thinkers started to push back against this idea. Like Aquinas said that divine illumination was only needed for things that are beyond our natural capacity to understand.
Okay.
And Duns Scotus, he really went after this guy, Henry of Ghent, who had a modified version of illuminationism.
Oh, what did Henry say?
He said there's a difference between knowing what something is and knowing its truth, its essential nature.
Yeah.
And he thought that to know the truth, you needed divine illumination. But Scotus said that would make us doubt our own ability to know anything for sure.
He thought we could get certain knowledge through our senses, through reasoning, and through our awareness of our own actions and experiences.
So no need for divine intervention.
Right. And he even said that repeated experience can lead to self-evident truths, like the idea that the same cause always produces the same effect.
But isn't that assuming that the future will always be like the past?
Yeah, Nicholas of Autrecourt pointed that out. He said, you can't be sure that just because something happened a certain way before, it will always happen that way.
Right.
So even though they didn't have a perfect alternative, the idea of divine illumination started to fade away.
And that paved the way for a stronger empiricist view.
Exactly. And this is where we see what the source calls cognitive empiricism and a move away from focusing so much on the intellect as the key to knowledge.
Okay.
So traditionally, the power of the mind to understand universals like redness or humanity was attributed to this thing called the agent intellect.
What's that?
It's a tricky concept. It comes from Aristotle, and it's about the mind's ability to grasp those abstract ideas.
Okay.
Some philosophers, like Avicenna and Averroes, they thought it was separate from our minds, like a higher intelligence that illuminates us. Others, like Aquinas, thought it was part of our own minds.
Interesting.
And this idea of the agent intellect was often tied to divine illumination.
I see.
But then comes William of Ockham. He was a nominalist, which means he didn't believe in universals as real things outside the mind.
So he didn't think redness exists as a separate thing.
Right, he thought it was just a name, a concept we use to group similar things together.
Okay.
And because of that, he didn't think we needed a separate agent intellect to grasp those universals.
Makes sense.
He said our primary knowledge comes from our experience of individual things, not from some abstract realm of universals.
Right. And this period also saw a renewed focus on experience and understanding cause and effect.
They did.
Yeah. Aristotle knew observation was important, but thinkers like Scotus and Occam really zoomed in on how we figure out causes by looking at what happens in the world. And this might be connected to the idea that God is all-powerful and the natural world isn't fixed. It's contingent on God's will.
So you have to observe to know how things actually work.
Right. And we see hints of controlled experiments.
Really?
Yeah, Grosseteste talked about testing different things to see what happens. And Scotus came up with ways to isolate causes by separating different factors and seeing what consistently leads to the effect.
Pretty clever.
And Occam had this simple rule for figuring out causes.
What was it?
He said that if the effect happens when something is present and it doesn't happen when that thing is absent, then that thing is probably the cause.
Makes sense.
So they were all about observing what happens, and they weren't so focused on the agent intellect anymore.
It sounds like they were getting closer and closer to a full-blown cognitive empiricism where experience is the foundation of everything.
They were. And that brings us to the end of our journey through ancient and medieval empiricism. We've seen a long and winding history of thinkers trying to figure out how we know what we know.
It's been a fascinating journey, and it shows that empiricism has deep roots. And, these ancient and medieval philosophers, they were wrestling with many of the same questions that we're still grappling with today.
That's true. Like, how do we reconcile what our senses tell us with theories that talk about things we can't observe?
Yeah. And how can we be sure about general rules when we can only see a limited number of things?
Right. What's the role of experience in understanding abstract stuff like math or figuring out cause and effect?
And what about universals? Those abstract concepts, are they real things or just names we give to groups of things?
These questions are still alive and well in philosophy today. Some people think innate knowledge is important, while others say experience is the key.
It's an ongoing debate, and it's fascinating to see how these historical figures shape the conversation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,